Right now, as you lay in the dark, you are likely trapped in the suffocating undertow of a past decision, replaying a single catastrophic choice that you believe permanently shattered your destiny. Your mind loops endlessly in the painful fantasy of an alternate timeline, a phantom life where you made the correct turn, stayed in the marriage, kept the business, or refused to abandon that promising career track. There is a bitter, cold ache in your chest as you look at your current life, viewing it as an inferior, broken remnant, while your true, perfect self lives out a magnificent existence in a universe you can never touch. This relentless rehearsal of what could have been leaves you feeling profoundly exhausted, as if you have spent years rowing a heavy boat against a solid stone wall of regret, permanently mourning the unlived life. If this heavy weight of self-sabotage is keeping your pulse fast tonight, know that your current location is not a mistake. In this room, the atmosphere is thick with the scent of damp wool and the slow, cool moisture that seeps from the floorboards after a long autumn rain. The corners of your space are dense and dark, offering a low, safe trench where the frantic need to rewrite your history is entirely suspended. The mattress beneath you does not require you to present an unbroken record of perfect choices before it agrees to absorb your fatigue. You are not a ruined map that needs to be frantically re-inked before the morning breaks. Tonight, we are not going to force you to heal your regret, nor will we demand that you forgive yourself for the missteps that brought you to this shore. Consider a strange, liberating paradox that sits at the center of your remorse, dear friend. Right now, maybe you have felt this too. The absolute conviction that you had the power to permanently derail the universe with one single mistake. The mind convinces you that if you had only chosen the other channel, your life would be an unclouded expanse of absolute fulfillment. Yet, in the light of classic Buddhist insight, this agonizing division of your destiny into a correct path and a ruined path is the very mechanism that keeps you paralyzed. We assume that our regret is a form of necessary penance, a useful internal trial that proves we know we did wrong. In reality, that mental trial is a total illusion, a phantom current that keeps your spirit exiled from the only water that can actually carry your boat forward. When you view your life through the lens of a ruined destiny, you are treating your existence as if it were a rigid canal that was meant to run in a perfectly straight line toward a specific, predetermined harbor. You believe that because you struck a sandbar or drifted into a stagnant bay, the entire journey has been stripped of its sacred value. But what if the river of your life was never designed to be a straight artificial channel? What if your true nature is actually the entire fluid mass of the water itself, which holds the mud, the clear springs, the wrong turns, and the wide estuaries simultaneously, completely free from the terrifying requirement to never make a mistake? The ancient masters of the Zen tradition often observed that our deepest suffering multiplies when we try to freeze a moving current into a static, unchanging image. We take a single moment of poor judgment and turn it into a permanent verdict about our capacity, believing that because we made a disastrous turn, we are fundamentally broken. We begin to fortify our regret, refusing to engage with our actual present, hoping to punish ourselves into a state of retrospective correctness, only to starve the very heart that needs to soften to live. If it feels right to you in this quiet hour, let your neck and the muscles around your collarbone sink just a fraction of an inch deeper into the dark. You do not have to resolve the long ache of your past decisions before your eyes are allowed to close. Tonight, there is absolutely no demand for you to straighten out the twisted lines of your history for the darkness. Right now, you can allow your entire life to be exactly like a heavy wooden steering sweep that has been laid flat across the deck of a drifting barge. The oar does not fight the river, and it does not scold itself for the murky water it pushed against. 3 miles upstream, it simply rests its wet grain in the shadow of the hull, holding its quiet density in total, unbothered silence. Let yourself notice the simple physical reality of the breath as it enters your nostrils. You do not need to measure the depth of your inhalation, and you do not need to achieve a perfect meditative state to be worthy of this quiet room. Just let the air slide into your frame like a low estuary fog, creeping through a thick bed of river reeds, observing how your chest expands and falls without any internal commentary. With every long exhale, imagine that you are letting the heavy stones of your phantom timelines slide out of your hands. You can allow the exhausting laboratory of your retrospective calculations to go completely dark for the evening. In a short while, we will travel down a misty waterway to a slow-moving river crossing to look at this human terror of a wasted life through a completely different lens. But before we journey there, let your awareness settle completely into the physical boundary of this moment. You are here, you are breathing, and you are entirely safe enough to let your defenses soften. The illusion that you must find a way to fix your past before you can rest can be left outside your door like a heavy, mud-caked coat. You do not need that coat tonight. You do not need to correct a single choice for your tomorrow. Listen closely to the vast quiet that remains when the heavy calculations of your remorse begin to taper off into the dark. That quiet is deep, it is spacious, and it contains no alternative channels from which you can be excluded. It is the wide, slow current that has always held you, waiting patiently for you to realize that you cannot ruin a life that is made of the very same water as the rest of the world. Let the weight of your shoulders sink down, and let the long anxiety of your regret dissolve into the unmeasured, foggy dark. Let the current of your attention drop away from the immediate evening, drifting backward to a wide, flat, low-country basin where the great rivers of the province slow down and flatten out into murky marshes. In this heavy, watery expanse, the air was permanently laden with the scent of rotting river reeds, wet clay silt, and the cold, mineral dampness of the low-hanging estuary fogs. To this isolated delta came a middle-aged man named Kazuo, whose mind was completely poisoned by a bitter, silent remorse. Years earlier, Kazuo had willfully walked away from his family's highly respected generational silk-weaving guild in the Eastern Hills, believing he could secure a massive fortune by investing in a merchant fleet. The venture had collapsed into an immediate public bankruptcy, leaving him destitute, cut off from his kin, and permanently marooned in his own thoughts. He spent every waking hour replaying the precise day he signed the paper, convinced that he had shattered his true destiny and that he was now living a completely worthless, phantom existence. To escape the burning glare of his memories, Kazuo took a menial position as an apprentice helper at a lonely, slow-moving ferry crossing, operated by an old silent ferryman named Master Jin. Jin was a small, weather-beaten elder whose skin had turned the color of cured cedar from a lifetime on the open water, and whose shoulders were permanently broadened by the constant resistance of the tides. He lived in a tiny thatch hut on the mudbanks, spending his free hours inspecting the massive, unpeeled hickory steering sweep oar that governed the trajectory of his flat-bottomed wooden barge. This sweep oar was an unpolished, massive object. Its long handle was darkened by generations of palm grease. Its wide blade was scarred by hidden river rocks, and the raw hickory wood fibers were so deeply saturated with water that the entire beam felt incredibly heavy, emitting a low, hollow groan whenever it was pivoted against the wet rawhide rowlocks. One cloudy afternoon, as a dense, freezing drizzle began to obscure the far bank of the estuary, a small party of travellers stepped onto the wooden barge. The water was exceptionally murky. That day, thick with a heavy, brown suspension of mountain mud that had been carried down by the early winter floods. Kazuo took his place near the stern, grasping the rough bark of the unpeeled hickory steering sweep oar with a tense, aggressive force. He was desperate to make a perfect crossing, hoping to prove to himself that he could still master a simple course, using the physical labor to outrun the suffocating internal loop of his regret. He pushed the heavy blade into the water, attempting to force the flat-bottomed craft through what he believed was the shortest, cleanest channel across the flats. Halfway through the crossing, the blade of the massive hickory oar suddenly struck an immense, invisible bank of underwater silt. The wood vibrated violently against Kazuo's ribs, and the entire barge ground to a sluggish, muddy halt in the middle of the misty channel. Kazuo froze, his face turning pale in the cold air, his heart hammering against his chest with a familiar wave of panic and absolute self-hatred. He immediately began to scold himself, assuming he had made yet another catastrophic error, misreading the water and ruining the journey for everyone on board. He tightened his grip on the bark handle until his knuckles turned white, trying to violently wrench the heavy hickory beam against the solid mass of mud beneath the hull. Master Jin did not shout, and he did not attempt to take the oar away from his frantic helper. The old ferryman simply walked over to the stern, placing his soft, calloused hand directly over Kazuo's trembling fingers on the dark wood. He leaned his weight against the oar, not to pull it out of the bank, but to let the blade sink even deeper into the heavy river silt. He looked out over the wide, grey expanse of the water, his voice sounding like the slow friction of wet ropes sliding over a wooden cleat. He asked Kazuo why he was fighting the mud, as if the silt were a separate enemy that had intentionally entered the river to ruin his day's work. Kazuo spat out a tight defensive response, saying that the silt was a miserable obstacle that had trapped the boat, proving that he had chosen the wrong channel and wasted the crossing. The old elder shook his head very slowly, letting a soft, unhurried sigh rise from his chest as the drizzle soaked his grey hair. He told Kazuo that this mud was not an error, nor was it a broken part of the river that needed to be avoided or erased. He explained that this silt contained the rich, washed-down topsoil of every mountain forest, every sacred valley, and every high temple garden 500 miles upstream. The river does not complain about carrying the debris of the high peaks, and it does not split itself into a perfect channel and a ruined channel. It simply holds the entire mass of the earth within its fluid body, moving the mud and the water together as one single, undivided current toward the vastness of the sea. He moved his hands down the hickory handle, guiding Kazuo to stop pushing against the bank and to instead let the oar rest lightly within the thick, granular embrace of the silt. He explained that when you believe you have broken your life, you are acting as if you are a separate architect who stands outside the great current, capable of making a mistake that the water cannot absorb. But you are not outside the river. Your past decisions, your bankruptcies, your failed tracks, and your deep regrets are simply the heavy, rich silt that has been carried down by the seasons of your journey. You cannot find a clean channel by trying to violently excise the mud from your history, for the mud is the very substance of the ground you are moving through. Kazuo stood perfectly still in the freezing mist, his palms resting against the cool, wet bark of the unpeeled hickory steering sweep oar. He felt the slow, steady vibration of the entire estuary moving against the wood, a massive, heavy pulse that carried no judgment and no memory of a better course. For the first time in many years, the sharp, suffocating knot of self-sabotage in his stomach began to loosen its grip, just a fraction of an inch. He looked down at the brown water swirling around the stern, realizing that his years of agonizing remorse were not an act of wisdom, but merely the illusion of a ferryman who was trying to steer a phantom boat on a river that did not exist. This heavy, hollow groan of the wooden oar binding against the underwater sandbar is not a signal for you to abandon your emotional nature or to grow emotionally numb to the real heartbreaks that have shaped your history. The deep teachings of the Zen lineage do not require you to construct an unfeeling, icy shell that remains untouched by the consequences of a difficult decision. This insight invites you into a far gentler, more forgiving spaciousness that opens up directly underneath our exhausting midnight loops of remorse. When we look at Kazuo, standing paralyzed at the stern of that flat-bottomed barge, his knuckles turning white in the cold drizzle, we are looking directly into our own Latinite paralysis. The true weight that was crushing the apprentice's spirit was not the single fact of his lost investment in the eastern hills, but the impossible demand that his life should have been a flawless, unclouded stream containing absolutely no debris. Perhaps you are carrying that identical, suffocating tension right now beneath the quiet shelter of your dark room. We are so quick to assume that our profound emotional exhaustion is caused solely by the outer events of our history, by the ventures that collapsed, the relationships that broke, or the alternative paths we dropped behind us in the dark. But if we let our awareness rest quietly in the stillness of this bed, a much more subtle truth begins to surface. The initial sting of a poor choice is like the sudden impact of the oar striking a hidden silt bank. It is a real event that occurs in a single moment of time. The true suffering, however, is the endless internal architecture we build around that event afterward, the invisible friction of a mind that keeps trying to wrench the handle, demanding that the river erase its own mud. The early seers noticed that human life naturally includes moments of miscalculation, sudden stagnation, and seasons where the water turns incredibly murky. These shifts are as inherent to our journey as the winter floods that wash the soil down from the high valleys. Yet, we tend to multiply this basic sorrow. We take an old instance of self-sabotage and weave an endless, terrifying narrative around it. A mental courtroom where we act as both the brutal prosecutor and the condemned prisoner, sentencing ourselves to a lifetime of internal exile. We construct a fictitious, perfect timeline in our memories, and then we use that imaginary benchmark to torture our actual, breathing hearts, paralyzing the very spirit that needs to rest in the low water to find its true path forward. What we often describe as attachment is nothing more than this white-knuckled grip on a specific, idealized portrait of how your destiny was supposed to be displayed. It is the urgent, anxious voice that insists you are not allowed to feel safe or whole until you are returned to that phantom channel where you never made a mistake. This mental gripping creates a deep, burning thirst, an agonizing craving that turns the rich, ordinary silt of your present reality into nothing more than a shameful mistake to be overcome. We treat tonight as a humiliating defeat, a broken interval that we must frantically repair through absolute self-reliance before we can finally give ourselves permission to take a full breath. When you operate from this state of defensive isolation, you are constantly pulling yourself away from the actual nutrients that are waiting to heal you. You are attempting to steer an imaginary vessel through a dry channel that vanished years ago, while neglecting the deep, slow-moving current that is resting beneath your shoulders right now. True mindfulness begins the very second you let go of the heavy steering sweep of your comparisons. It is the soft capacity to look at your current life with all its murky depths and hidden sandbars without immediately treating it as a total catastrophe. It is the simple willingness to rest in the low water of your own experience and allow the silt to be silt without demanding that it instantly turn into a crystal spring. This softening of the mind is not an act of lazy defeat or a sign that you have surrendered your true potential. Rather, it is a profound realization of how life actually finds its resilience. You are choosing to stop spending your vital energy on a civil war against the gravity of your circumstances. You are recognizing that true peace is not a static course, but a dynamic capacity to join the river, to hold the mud of the entire mountain range, and to turn a sudden stagnation into a lasting sanctuary for the heart. The continuous impermanence of your days is not a threat to your safety, but the exact guarantee that your current state of numbness cannot last forever. The density of your life is shifting even while you are resting, preparing a new flow beneath the surface of your conscious thoughts. When you practice this deep, emotional acceptance, you are offering a rare form of kindness to your own tired framework. You are deciding that you have played the part of the lonely sentry for long enough. You are choosing to meet your rejections, not with a sharp shield of hypervigilance, but with the warm, unhurried presence of a companion who stands with you in the quiet valley. You are allowing the extra, exhausting layers of self-defense to fall away from your heart, leaving only the clean, simple reality of the breath you are taking right now. Consider how much lighter your chest becomes when you realize you do not have to fix the design of your life tonight. You do not have to justify your displacement or prove your worth to the people who dropped you before your eyes are allowed to close. Those prominent rooflines are nothing more than ideas sketched on a blueprint that the mind keeps turning over in the dark. Tonight, your only territory, soft perimeter of this mattress and the slow, cool air that moves into your body and carries away the heat of your old fortresses. Let the thoughts of where you should have been displayed drop into the darkness like heavy pieces of clay falling into the soft grass. You can listen to the vast, open space that remains when the defense stops. In a short while, we will explore a direct, somatic way to let this low stillness sink into the very center of your physical framework, anchoring you far beneath the urgent voices of your pride. But for now, let yourself absorb the quiet grace of being completely dropped. There is no shame in the low ground of your life, for it is precisely where the deepest, most resilient roots are quietly gathering their power to bloom. If it feels right to you now, let us bring this wide, muddy estuary crossing closer to your own physical framework. There is no need to change your posture or to alter your current position in any way. You can remain exactly as you are, letting your limbs settle deeper into the firm, unquestioning support of the mattress beneath your spine. Perhaps you might allow your eyelids to grow a bit heavier, letting the visual world dissolve into a soft, dark, unmeasured canvas. There is no requirement to perform a perfect relaxation technique tonight. There is no specific standard of calmness you have to achieve in this quiet space. Even simply noticing the slow expansion of your ribcage is completely enough to anchor your spirit. Let us begin by bringing a very soft, unhurried attention to the rhythm of your breath. As the air moves inward, feel the cool touch of the night atmosphere inside your nasal passages. As the air moves outward, notice the subtle warmth that leaves your chest, carrying away a small pocket of the heat that is built up in your forehead during the day. If you choose to, you might imagine that each breath is like a slow wave of low estuary fog creeping through a thick bed of river reeds. There is no need to force the breath to become deeper or slower than it naturally wants to be. Just let the lungs fill according to their own biological rhythm, like a quiet room that opens and closes its doors in absolute silence. As you follow this natural flow, you might notice a specific thought drifting into your awareness. This might be a lingering memory of that one turning point, a sudden flash of panic about your current standing, or a sharp phrase of self-reproach that you have used to punish your own history. Do not push that thought away with aggression, and do not try to delete it from your mind. When we fight our memories, we are only creating more splinters and more inner noise. Instead, just name the pattern quietly to yourself. You might softly whisper the word steering, or perhaps the word fighting, inside your mind. By simply giving it a gentle name, you are stepping off the frantic ladder of your calculations and becoming the quiet observer who stands on the deck. Now, if it feels comfortable, imagine that this specific fear of a wasted life, this heavy weight of needing to find a perfect, unclouded channel, can be collected from the spaces around your temples. Picture yourself gently, placing this sharp, jagged worry directly into that thick, brown mountain mud that is floating through the water. See the thought sinking into the dense, coarse texture of the river silt, where the heavy materials surrounds it, cushions it, and takes away its cutting edge. The mud does not judge the thought. It does not call it a weakness or a fault. It simply absorbs the heat of that mental friction into its own endless, silent interior. Watch what happens to that image as you let go of your grip on that handle of your self-reliance. In the quiet dark of the deep estuary, the sharp lines of your regrets slowly begin to soften. The rigid corners of your pride dissolve into the rich, protective darkness of the silt. The worry is no longer a weapon used against your heart, but simply a raw material, a tiny particle of dust that is resting in the damp womb of the river. It can sit there for weeks or months or years, completely safe from the burning light of judgment, accumulating the quiet density that can only grow when you stop trying to force the water to become clear. With the next few exhales, let your physical body mimic that unbothered stability of the resting oar. You might feel your jaw slacken just a bit, releasing the hidden clenches that carry the tension of trying to correct your history. Let your shoulders drop down, sinking heavily into the mattress like massive hickory timbers settling into the shadow of the hull. After a long journey through the rapids, let the muscles in your lower back, your hips, and your thighs surrender their entire weight to the bed, trusting that the ground beneath you is perfectly capable of holding everything you are carrying. You do not need to support your own life right now. The river has you completely supported. Perhaps your mind will try to wander back to the surface, back to the old habit of counting your missteps. If that happens, there is no need to feel frustrated or think that you are failing at this practice. You can return to the breath whenever you are ready, without a single word of self-reproach. The mind has been trained for decades to run in circles around its phantom timelines, and it takes time for that tired animal to realize that the oar has been laid down tonight. Every time you notice the wandering and gently bring your awareness back to the cool touch of the air, you are loosening one more stone in the air. There is absolutely no requirement for immediate emotional healing or instant transformation tonight. We are not trying to force a sudden, dramatic breakthrough that cures your regret by tomorrow morning. We are simply allowing the mind to spend a few hours resting in its own unformed space. You are giving yourself the rare permission to be completely unfinished, completely unpolished, and completely safe in your current stillness. Let the rhythmic motion of your breath carry you deeper down, away from the loud demands of the elevated world and into the silent velvet of this timeless night. Let your awareness float like a flat-bottomed boat that has been tethered to a solid wooden post in the marsh. The water rises very slowly beneath your frame, and the water falls very slowly beneath your frame. But the boat itself does not need to travel a single yard to remain perfectly balanced. The dark current knows exactly how to cradle your weight without requiring you to provide a destination. You can let the water do the holding. You can let the night do the breathing. You can simply exist as a quiet space where the silt is allowed to settle to the very bottom of the river basin, leaving the surface of your mind as smooth and undisturbed as a sheet of dark glass under the evening sky. As the quiet hours deepen, feel the cool air brushing against the skin of your forehead, smoothing away the microscopic lines of focus that you gathered during the day. Let your hands relax completely, letting the fingers curl naturally into the palms without any need to hold on to a single rope or tool. There are no channels you have to master before the dawn, and there are no currents you have to outmaneuver to earn your right to exist. The entire landscape is resting with you, wrapped in a single thick blanket of low-country fog that makes all separate paths completely invisible. You are here, you are whole, and you are permitted to let the river carry you away into the deep dark. 7 rainy summers melted into the low delta, and the slow river valley faced a transformation that no one could have anticipated. A massive, catastrophic midsummer flood breached the high mountain reservoirs far to the north, altering the ancient course of the water entirely, carving out vast new channels through the forests, and leaving the old, traditional ferry crossing stranded a mile away from the living river. The wooden barge that Master Jin had maintained for decades lay half buried in a stagnant, rotting pool of sun-baked mud, its timbers cracking under the heat. The old ferryman passed away during the season of the Great Retreat, leaving Kazuo entirely alone in a changing landscape that no longer required his labor or his navigation. The ancient, icy panic of having squandered his entire existence flared up in Kazuo's chest with a terrifying, suffocating velocity, causing his jaw to lock as he stared at the dry, useless mudflats. He felt that his destiny had been broken twice, first by his own disastrous financial choice in the eastern hills, and now by the careless hand of nature itself, leaving him to rot beside an abandoned channel, deep within an isolated, labyrinthine salt marsh 3 miles south of the old crossing, where the tides met the river water, and the air always smelled of damp hemp rope, tallow grease, and marsh grass, lived a reclusive old reed weaver named Sister Chio. She resided in a tiny round hut woven entirely out of wild switchgrass, her skin looking like dark leather from a lifetime of gathering plants in the brackish brine. She spent her solitary days navigating the unpredictable, shifting shallows of the new estuary using a small wooden skiff. Her single primary tool for safety was a heavy, hand-carved, stone-sounding weight, a smooth block of black basalt tied to a thick 20-foot length of twisted hemp rope that had grown dark, swollen, and stiff from decades of constant submersion in the murky current. When Kazuo finally stumbled into her marsh camp one cold evening, his clothes caked in dried clay and his mind vibrating with an intense, defensive bitterness, he was on the absolute verge of collapse. He sat down on a bundle of wet reeds, his hands shaking as he told her that his life had become a complete and total mockery. He complained that the river had stolen his only remaining purpose, leaving him to survive as a useless relic of a channel that did not exist anymore, proving that every choice he had ever made was a permanent curse. Sister Chio did not stop her work, and she did not offer him a single word of philosophical pity. She simply reached over the side of her wooden skiff and dropped the hand-carved stone, sounding weight, directly into the brown, swirling water of the new channel. The thick hemp rope zipped through her calloused palms with a wet, raspy hiss until the line suddenly went slack, indicating that the heavy block of black basalt had reached the absolute bottom of the basin. She let the rope sway gently in the tide, holding it with 2 fingers, feeling the subtle vibrations of the hidden currents shifting far below the surface. She looked at Kazuo through the low evening fog, inviting him to place his hand on the wet hemp string. She asked him if he believed the stone weight was failing its duty when it sank into the dark mud where no one could see its form. Kazuo touched the rough, wet line, his breath catching in his throat as he felt the heavy, unhurried pulse of the new riverbed transmitting directly through the fibers. He noticed that the stone weight was not fighting the silt or screaming for a clearer path. It was simply resting within the uncertainty of the floor, providing a single, accurate measure of the depth exactly where it had landed. Sister Chio rubbed her thumb against the dark hemp, her voice sounding like the low rustle of dry reeds in a midnight wind. She told Kazuo that his torment did not arise from the flood changing the river, but from his stubborn habit of treating his thoughts of a ruined destiny as an absolute, immutable truth. She explained that when he was a prominent figure in the silk weaving trade, he thought he was a master of his own destination, looking down on the lower world. But that security was an illusion born of a static map. When the map was torn apart by reality, his ego called it a shameful exile, a permanent error that ruined his worth. She took the heavy stone-sounding weight out of the water and laid its cold, wet black surface directly into Kazuo's lap, its dampness soaking through his cotton tunic. She told him that the rarest, most resilient marsh reeds, the very plants she used to weave shelter for the homeless, could never find a home on the high, rocky cliffs of the eastern hills. They required the heavy, shifting mud banks of the low country, growing only where the river had dropped its debris after a catastrophic storm. True liberation does not mean you never lose your original channel. It means that when the current shifts, you stop mourning the old banks and choose to feel the depth of the water that is actually surrounding your hull. Kazuo sat perfectly still in the low country marsh, his hands cupping the cold, unpolished basalt block in his lap. A subtle, quiet transformation occurred within the center of his chest, not like a sudden explosion of light, but like the slow, steady settling of sand inside a disturbed well. He saw that his entire maturity had been a frantic, white-knuckled attempt to maintain a specific, artificial course that was never destined to last. He had been using his regret as a heavy anchor to punish himself for the crime of being redirected by life, turning his memories into a toxic wall that refused the very current that was trying to carry his spirit. He did not magically become a flawless master, and he did not pretend that the loss of his family's trade did not still leave a quiet ache in his memory. But he chose to implement one small, disciplined shift in his behavior. He stopped the internal habit of treating every thought of failure as an undisputed fact. When the old voice of self-sabotage began to whisper that he was a broken man, he simply paused, took one long, slow breath of the brackish air, and refused to follow the thought down its familiar, agonizing trail. He stood up, walked to the edge of the water, and helped the old woman lift her heavy bundles of harvested reeds into the skiff. He moved his limbs with an unhurried, deliberate cadence, sitting quietly with the uncertainty of the changing delta, allowing the wet stone in his hands to teach him how to rest exactly where the river met the sea. This quiet integrations beside the old reed weaver's skiff invites us to look directly into the deep mechanics of our own internal suffering. When you find yourself lying awake in the solitary dark, your mind is often operating like a frantic navigator, trying to patch an unraveling sail in the middle of a midnight gale. You rehearse your future, spinning endless complex strategies to prevent the next sudden displacement or the next cold wave of rejection from someone you love. You replay your past errors, turning over old choices, like a worker who keeps running his bare fingers over a jagged gash in a broken timber, staring at the split line as if his intense gaze could somehow force the grain to fuse back together. This chronic internal vigilance is driven by a profound terror of the low, muddy ground. We believe that if we do not constantly guard our parameters and maintain an unassailable trajectory, we will be cast aside and forgotten by the world entirely. We seek the constant approval of others to validate our position on the high cliffs, treating their attention like the anchoring pins that hold our entire identity in place. When that validation is withdrawn, a cold wave of shame floods our internal channels, and we use harsh self-judgment as a crude tool to punish our own hearts. We think that if we make our inner walls rigid enough, we will somehow force our lives into an unbreakable shape. Eventually, we turn this very state of defensive isolation into our permanent definition, identifying only as the stranded vessel that is too damaged to ever enter the living river again. Simple Buddhist wisdom offers a gentle, unhurried clarity. For this exact pattern of exhaustion, the old teachings remind us that there is a vast difference between the natural impact of life and the extra suffering we generate through our own resistance. The first layer of discomfort is simply the honest weight of reality. It is like the natural winter rain that falls on the marsh, or the sudden, cold splash when a wave breaches the gunwale of a small wooden skiff. This is the raw fact of an alliance ending, a financial plan dissolving, or an aging body feeling the heavy drag of fatigue. This layer of experience is completely unavoidable, belonging to the changing seasons of the estuary, and no amount of anxious calculation can ever banish it from our human existence. The true agony we feel, however, is entirely constructed by our desire for absolute control over the current. This added suffering is like taking a rough, dry hemp rope and frantically pulling it back and forth across a raw friction burn on your palm, trying to force the skin to become smooth again by your own violent friction. The original break was a single, clean moment of impact when the boat struck the silt, but your frantic pulling goes on for days, weeks, and decades, grinding away the very substance of the skin, creating a constant, burning heat that fills your entire chest with tension. The raw rope does not restore the skin to its uninjured state. It only thins out the material until it bleeds completely. Our self-criticism is that relentless rope, turning a temporary displacement into a permanent, agonizing disintegration. True tranquility does not arrive because you finally discover a magic harbor where no channel ever shifts and no human being ever leaves your side. You cannot alter the changing weather of the world, and you cannot force another heart to maintain its position on your schedule. Peace begins the exact millisecond you choose to drop the heavy hemp rope of your resistance. It is the realization that your ultimate security does not depend on your ability to remain perfectly elevated and untouched by the storm. You can learn the quiet wisdom of the dark basalt block, which does not demand that the riverbed remain flat or clear. The stone simply accepts the mud bank exactly where it has landed, letting its heavy weight sink into the soft silt, transforming a site of sudden stagnation into a quiet sanctuary for the current to fold around. Let the physical casing of your chest expand as you absorb this realization tonight. You can drop the exhausting project of trying to cure your loneliness through the application of a harsh inner commentary. Tonight, you can allow the entire jury of your worries to fall completely silent in the dark. You do not have to present an unbroken record of success to the night, and you do not have to prove your independence to the sky. You can let your awareness rest deeply within the unhurried weight of your own body, knowing that the dropped weight is already safe, already quiet, and already sufficient for the life that is waiting to open beneath the surface. When you look closely at your own history, you can see how many years you have spent trying to build an unyielding fortress out of your fears. We treat our thoughts as if they were solid stone embankments, believing that every worry about the future is an absolute truth that must be managed with absolute urgency. We buy into the illusion that if we just scold ourselves with enough intensity, we will eventually become so flawless that no one will ever leave us behind again. But this inner violence only splits the timber further, creating deep internal fractures that make it impossible for us to feel the real support that is already surrounding our lives. The Buddhist path invites you to step completely out of this cycle of fabrication. It asks you to recognize that your true nature is not a separate, fragile skiff that must compete for a space in the high channels. You are the entire estuary, the wet silt, the growing marsh grass, and the quiet fog in the delta. When you realize that you are inextricably woven into the fabric of the whole basin, the fear of being dropped loses its terrifying authority over your sleep. You cannot be cast out of a world that is made of the very same elements as your own breathing framework. Let your shoulders sink another fraction of an inch into the deep dark of your room. You can let the heavy iron tools of your judgments slip from your hands, letting them rest on the floorboards like gear whose season has finally drawn to a close. There are no measurements to take tonight, and there are no assessments to pass before you are allowed to enter a deep rest. The broken pieces of your day can simply lay in the soft silt of your memory, entirely unbothered by the need for immediate symmetry. You can let the quiet, cool air move through the open spaces of your chest, carrying away the lingering smoke of your old battles as you prepare to sink into a tranquility that requires no defense. As you linger in this still interval, consider how much freedom is born when you stop treating your loneliness as a personal defect. The emptiness of the channel is not a punishment, but a vast, open invitation for your spirit to return to its original depth. You can allow your narrative to remain completely unfinished tonight without a single plan to fix the broken tracks of your tomorrow. You are here, you are breathing, and the dark earth beneath you is fully capable of holding your entire weight without a single condition. Let the slow current of your breath pull you down, away from the loud demands of the elevated world and into the soft, mossy sanctuary of this unmeasured night. Now let us take this heavy, basalt-sounding block and the unpeeled hickory steering beam directly into the crowded landscape of your modern tomorrow. When the sun breaks through the low mist and the loud competitive theatre of your regular routine begins, this marsh wisdom is not meant to be left behind like a forgotten bundle of reeds on an abandoned mudflat. It is designed to be lived in the very center of your ordinary, frantic hours. You will likely feel that old, familiar tightness in your chest tomorrow afternoon when you find yourself staring at a small digital screen, waiting for a single text or an update that feels like it holds the absolute power to decide if your life is moving in the correct channel. It is so easy in that brief, trembling second to grasp your phone with a desperate, white-knuckled grip, constantly refreshing the screen for a shred of validation to prove you have not been stranded on a sandbar. You might encounter this cold, silent panic when you walk through a bustling environment, observing colleagues or peers who appear to be skimming over the water with a flawless, effortless precision toward their magnificent markers of public success. In those moments, we often display an artificial, smiling mask to the world, pretending to be completely content while carrying a massive, waterlogged weight of inadequacy beneath our tailored jackets. We look at our separate, mud-caked history through the selective window of a social application, treating the smooth profiles of others as if they were deep, clear channels that only highlight the sluggish, shallow silt of our own path. We stand in the middle of our days feeling thoroughly behind, as if we had dropped our oars in the weeds while the rest of the world was completing its grand voyage to the open ocean. The practice of this Zen path does not require you to drop your current job or abandon the human beings who depend on your daily steering. It is practiced in the tiny, quiet micro-pauses that occur between your frantic appointments, through the simple choosing of a softer relationship with the mud. When that old urgency of an ancient regret strikes your heart, tomorrow morning you can choose to pause for the length of a single, unhurried breath before you click a button or reply to an unsettling email. In that quiet interval, you can recognize that the loud, frantic calculations rattling behind your eyes are not absolute, structural blueprints. They are merely loose flakes of bark drifting down the handle of an oar. You can choose not to obey every frantic thought that tells you your destiny has been ruined. You can learn the rare, beautiful art of caring deeply for your projects and your relationships without trying to lock them into an unchanging, rigid framework with an unyielding clamp. When you find yourself trying to force an answer from a fragile alliance that is still forming its boundaries, remember the raw stone-sounding weight resting in its bed of silt, trying to yank a career transition or a complex emotional bond into a sudden, perfect shape, only strains the delicate hemp fibers that require time to adjust to the actual depth of the river. You can provide the clean deck of your daily effort. You can clear away the sharp flints of yesterday's recriminations. And then you can have the immense bravery to leave the stone alone in its dark, quiet resting place. Perhaps the most radical act of self-forgiveness. You to allow your limbs to rest without requiring a receipt of your optimization to justify the pause. We have been conditioned to believe that our human value must be earned by running ourselves directly into the sandbars of total exhaustion, treating every hour of non-doing as a dangerous mistake that will ruin our potential. But in the light of the reed weaver's wisdom, rest is not a reward for an unbroken record of achievement. It is the fundamental space where the density of your spirit is allowed to settle into its true, organic depth. You do not need to apologize to the universe for sitting quietly with your palms open, or for letting your eyes close in the middle of a heavy, grey afternoon. You are simply allowing the irregular current of your life to breathe without the pressure of the tape measure. When the mind tries to drag you into a frantic rehearsal of a future that hasn't occurred, pull your awareness back to the immediate physical facts of your immediate environment. Feel the solid texture of the glass against the skin of your fingers, or notice the cool temperature of the tile pressing against the soles of your feet. These simple sensory realities are your flexible anchoring weights, pinning you firmly into the only water where your life actually exists. You are not late for your destiny, because your destiny is only unfolding in the exact millimeter of the present breath. As the daylight begins to taper off once more, you can feel an immense sense of relief washing over your limbs. The long, exhausting project of trying to prove your worth to an imaginary audience can be completely retired for the evening. You can look back at the day you have just completed with all its undone chores and unrefined edges, and you can offer it a gentle, accepting nod. It was a day of subterranean settling, a day of allowing the wood to adjust to the moisture of the marsh, and that is more than enough to be holy. You can lay your tools down on the deck, slip off the heavy armor of your expectations, and Allow your entire being to drift toward the vast, timeless sanctuary of the night. The room has grown completely still now, and the rigid measuring lines of the waking world have completely dropped away from your mind. You can let your awareness slide down from the noisy geometric demands of numbers, plans, and expectations, sinking softly into the vast, protective dark of this immediate night. The long journey through the muddy delta channels and the wide, misty marsh is entirely finished, and the wisdom of the unpeeled hickory steering sweep is settling into the very marrow of your bones. Your breath is becoming a quiet whisper, a soft, undulating ripple that passes through a body that has finally chosen to lay down its heavy iron tools. With each slow release of air, your limbs are growing increasingly heavy, sinking into the soft support of the mattress, like a dense block of basalt settling into the deep, damp silt of the quietest riverbed. There is an immense, heavy comfort in realizing that you do not need to build a single thing over the course of these dark hours. The exhausting task of correcting your path, analyzing your mistakes, and proving your worth to the world can be completely suspended. The darkness of this room is a sanctuary where you are entirely permitted to be unformed, unpolished, and completely hidden from the sharp light of evaluation. You can let the muscles around your eyes soften, letting the heavy velvet of sleep wash over your vision as your consciousness prepares to return to its original, unmeasured home. Imagine your tired mind descending smoothly into the cool, dark center of a vast estuary, far beneath the surface where the winter wind is blowing itself out. Down in these thick, protective depths, there are no channels to force, and there are no straight lines demanding a perfect execution. The deep water sleeps securely within its thick layers of old silt, completely indifferent to the storms raging outside, knowing that its raw, mud-filled state is not a failure but the very cradle of its enduring substance. You are that dark basin tonight, heavy, unbothered, and entirely absolved from the requirement to match a neat blueprint before the morning. Let the weight of your head drop deeper into the pillow, releasing the very last percentage point of control you have carried since the dawn. Your shoulders are heavy, your chest is open and slow, and your legs are completely anchored in the deep, unmoving stillness of the bed. You do not have to solve the long riddle of your career, your relationships, or your unfulfilled years before your eyes close. You are given the absolute, unconditional permission to drop the project of your entire life for the night, leaving the unfinished pieces to sit quietly in the dark loam of reality. The silence that fills the spaces between your slow breaths is old, vast, and entirely unconcerned with human hurry. It is the same quiet density that held the delta waters for thousands of years, before the first wooden barge was ever launched. Let yourself dissolve into that timeless space, letting go of the boundary where your body ends and the night begins. You are safe enough to disappear into the dreamless dark, trusting that the ground has you held, and that the subterranean movement of your spirit is working in secret to heal the places you could never fix by overthinking. Listen to the rhythmic fading of the world as your consciousness glides into the deep, dark waters of sleep. There is nowhere else you need to travel, and there is no version of yourself you need to invent to be worthy of this rest. The winter is peaceful, the silt is thick, and the unmeasured self is resting in absolute safety beneath the fog. What if the very path you believe you permanently ruined was actually the river's only way of carrying you to the sea. The deep waters do not require you to provide a sudden explanation to your overstimulated intellect, because the quiet alchemy of the delta silt operates entirely outside the boundaries of the high, rigid roads you have left behind. As you rest here in the absolute neutrality of this dark room, letting your thoughts drift past the perimeter of the modern schedule, we find Kazuo sitting on the low, root-strewn bank of the new marsh channel. Long after the twilight has dissolved into a dense indigo blackness, he did not rush back up the river to reconstruct the empty docks of the old crossing, and he did not light a pitch torch to draft a new map for drawing his lost connections back to the basin. Instead, he simply sat in the thick stillness of the swamp, listening to the slow, steady gurgle of the water, moving through the exposed roots of the willow trees, feeling the damp, salt-laden mud cooling the skin of his calloused palms. The air had become incredibly cold, smelling of crushed wild, sage, wet iron scales, and the deep, clean minerals of ancient granite that had been ground down into fine powder by 10,000 winters of river travel. For the first time since his public exile from the silk-weaving guild, Kazuo was not looking at the abandoned timber barge as a personal accusation or a visible monument to his permanent failure. He noticed a cluster of small, wild river oysters that had attached themselves directly onto the waterlogged surface of the unpeeled hickory steering sweep oar that lay soaking in the shallows. Their rough, lime-crusted shells were completely undisturbed by the freezing drizzle, closed tightly against the tide like tiny, stone hearts, protecting a quiet secret. The oysters did not scold the hickory beam for falling into the mud, and they did not experience a state of frantic panic because their home was a rough piece of wood resting in a swamp rather than a polished cedar display shelf in a city mansion. They simply accepted the wet, uneven bark of the timber, using the structural displacement of the ferry crossing as the exact foundation for their own quiet existence. Sister Chiyo emerged from the dark interior of her switchgrass hut, carrying a small, unglazed earthenware cup filled with a thick, aromatic oil pressed from wild hemp seeds and dark vegetable tallow. She did not speak a single word of hollow consolation, and she did not tell him that his merchant wealth would one day be restored or celebrated across the province. She simply took her calloused, salt-stained thumb and smeared a drop of the thick grease across the raw, dry friction, burns that the hemp ropes had carved into his palms hours ago. The oil felt intensely cold, at first its heavy thickness sealing the chapped skin and blocking out the biting chill of the midnight fog. She told him that when a traveller is caught in the trap of his own pride, he believes that the ultimate goal of his life is to remain suspended in a permanent sky, unbroken and admired by the people on the shore. But the real master knows that the true sanctuary is found only when you become identical to the low riverbed itself, which never rejects a single grain of mountain mud, never judges a broken skiff, and changes its form so fluidly that it can never be truly fractured by the storm. Let this thick, protective balm of the marsh seed oil settle over your own internal wounds tonight, as you feel the heavy gravity of the bed holding your frame in place. You might imagine that your over-fortified, hyper-vigilant mind is being gently coated with that cool, soothing tallow, closing up the raw fissures of your worries and shielding your awareness from the cold wind of your lingering rejections. There is absolutely no need to sketch a single plan for tomorrow's defense, while your body is trying to return to its natural, unmeasured rhythm. The thoughts of the texts you are waiting for, the memories of the people who chose to walk away, and the deep, silent shame of feeling left behind are all being covered by this dark, healing ointment, losing their capacity to sting or restrict the rising of your chest. Kazuo closed his eyes in the dark marsh, letting his hands rest completely flat against the damp earth beneath the willow tree. Beneath his palms, he could feel the immense, silent vibration of the entire basin's floor. It was a massive, unhurried presence that had existed for thousands of winters, before the first human sail had ever been raised against the wind. The delta did not care about the titles of the merchants, and it did not recognize the difference between a golden treasury and a heap of rotting reeds in a ditch. It held everything with an absolute, unconditional neutrality, allowing the timbers to split, the communities to disperse, and the mists to gather without a single moment of internal resistance or preference. Kazuo realized that he was not a separate, lonely entity fighting against his displacement. He was merely a transient cluster of elements, moving within the river's vast, changing breath. When you allow your awareness to drop down into that same deep neutrality, the heavy burden of your personal history begins to lose its suffocating grip. You can see that your current state of isolation is not a permanent defect in your soul, but merely a temporary configuration of shadows that will shift as naturally as the low fog moving through the sunless marsh. You do not have to carry the identity of the person who was set aside, or the person who is running out of time, or the person who must constantly prove their self-sufficiency to an imaginary audience. You can simply be the vast, quiet space of this room, a neutral sanctuary where the air moves in and out of the lungs, without needing to meet a single requirement or justify a single line of your past. Consider the immense, liberating relief that arrives when you realize that your life path is not a pre-existing maze that you must solve with absolute accuracy to avoid being discarded. There is no secret blueprint hidden in the clouds that you are failing to discover. True. The path is nothing more than the physical print that your foot leaves behind when it strikes the real earth. Every choice you make, whether it leads to a magnificent height or a quiet fragment buried in the silt, is a valid, necessary stroke upon the raw material of your existence. Each displacement is simply a pale gash that reveals the deep, fragrant texture of your inner grain, adding to your wisdom, your empathy, and your capacity to hold the suffering of other living things with a gentle, unhurried compassion. Sister Chiyo turned away, her dark linen robes rustling softly against the wet mud as she walked back toward the deep shadow of her round hut. She did not look back to see if Kazuo was following her, and she did not demand a single promise about his future devotion to the marsh. She left him alone in the dark with the heavy stone-sounding weight, the unpeeled hickory ore, and the immense, quiet valley. Kazuo did not feel lonely in that isolation. He felt a profound, heavy sense of home. He was finally standing in the raw workshop of his own reality, completely stripped of his maps, completely stripped of his illusions of control, yet completely safe within his own skin. Your own physical framework can receive that exact sense of returning home tonight. You can let the muscles in your neck, your upper back, and your rib cage soften completely into the deep mattress, allowing the heavy gravity of the earth to claim your entire weight. There is no need to defend your parameters. And there is no need to keep your guard up against the uncertainty of tomorrow. The world outside your room will continue to turn according to its own complex, unhurried laws. And you do not need to oversee its machinery while your body is trying to rest. You can let the long, white-knuckled effort of your life fall to the floorboards like a heavy hickory steering beam that has finished its work for the season. Let the slow, rhythmic cadence of this prose act like a soft blanket of snow falling over the low estuary, burying the sharp flints, the cracked timbers, and the deep ruts under a single, unified layer of quiet, cold peace. The thoughts of your peers, the calculations of your worth, and the heavy anxieties of your relationships are all being muffled by this soft, falling stillness, losing their edges and turning into a quiet, neutral dark that contains no demands and no timelines. You are safe enough to let your breathing become completely quiet, a soft, natural rise and fall that requires no monitoring and no precision to be perfect. As the night wraps its ultimate velvet folds around your room, allow yourself to drop the very last project of your conscious mind. You do not need to understand your life tonight, and you do not need to forgive yourself, and you do not need to find the correct direction for your next step. You can simply allow your entire being to become like that heavy stone-sounding weight, resting securely in the deep silt of the marsh floor, completely unmeasured, completely unpolished, and completely safe within the dark, fragrant sanctuary of its own unformed heart. Let the sleep wash over your forehead, letting your consciousness slide down into the dreamless, timeless mud of the earth, where there are no corners to square, no judgments to face, and no paths that can ever be truly lost. What if the very path you believe you permanently ruined was actually the river's only way of carrying you to the sea?